A horse wandered into an orphanage and changed a child's destiny forever. It seems impossible, right? You might think this story is just another legend. But what happened is real and shocking. It all started when a horse from a nearby farm mysteriously got loose and ran towards the orphanage, as if it knew something was wrong. The children and the caretakers were paralyzed, not understanding why the horse was there. But then, he started banging loudly on the door of one of the rooms. It was at this moment that the orphanage staff decided to investigate the room. What they found inside will send shivers down your spine. The old orphanage stood like a sentinel on the outskirts of Millbrook, its weathered brick walls a stark contrast to the lush green fields that surrounded it. For most of the townspeople, it was just another building, a place they passed by without a second glance. But for the children within its walls, it was a world unto itself, a place where hope often came to wither and dreams struggled to take flight. Among these children was Ethan, a boy of 10 with eyes that seemed to hold the weight of the world. His small frame often hunched over as if trying to make himself invisible, a habit born from years of disappointment and neglect. Ethan's days were a monotonous blend of routine and longing, each hour marked by the ticking of the ancient clock in the common room, its steady rhythm a constant reminder of time passing him by. Ms. Bell, the orphanage director, ran the establishment with an efficiency that left little room for warmth. Her heels clicked sharply against the worn wooden floors as she made her rounds, a sound that sent children scurrying to appear busy and well-behaved. Her thin lips seemed perpetually pursed, as if tasting something sour, and her gray eyes missed nothing. "Ethan," she called one afternoon, her voice cutting through the quiet murmur of the playroom. "Why aren't you outside with the others?" Ethan looked up from his tattered sketchbook, his pencil poised mid-stroke. I just wanted to finish my drawing, Ms. Bell," he said softly, his eyes darting nervously to the window where other children played under the watchful eyes of the staff. "Ms." Bell's gaze softened for just a moment, a flicker of something almost like pity crossing her features before her usual stern expression returned. "Very well," she said crisply. "But remember, Ethan, it's important to socialize. How do you expect a family to choose you if you're always hiding away?" As she turned to leave, Ethan's shoulders slumped further. He knew she meant well in her own way, but her words stung like salt in an open wound. Family. It was a word that haunted his dreams and shadowed his days. How many times had he watched other children leave, their faces alight with joy as they clutched the hands of their new parents? How many nights had he lain awake, imagining what it would feel like to belong? Turning back to his sketchbook, Ethan's pencil moved with renewed purpose. On the page, a majestic horse took shape, its mane flowing in an imaginary wind, its eyes alive with a wild freedom that made Ethan's heart ache. In his mind, he could almost hear the thundering of hooves, feel the rush of wind against his face as he rode across open fields, leaving the orphanage far behind. Outside, the sky began to darken, heavy clouds rolling in from the west. The first fat drops of rain splattered against the window, and Ethan watched as the other children were ushered inside, their laughter and chatter filling the halls. He remained where he was, lost in his own world of graphite and paper, where loneliness couldn't touch him and dreams still had the power to come true. As night fell and the storm intensified, Ethan lay in his narrow bed, listening to the rain lashing against the windows and the wind howling through the eaves. In the distance, barely audible above the tempest, he thought he heard something else, a sound unlike anything he'd heard before. It was a high, piercing whinny, full of wildness and freedom. Little did Ethan know that this storm would mark the beginning of a change in his life, a turning point that would lead him down a path he could never have imagined. For out there in the darkness, Beyond the high walls of the orphanage, something extraordinary was about to happen. Something that would shake the foundations of Ethan's world and open doors he thought were forever closed. The wind seemed to whisper promises of adventure, and for the first time in years, Ethan fell asleep with a smile on his face, his dreams filled with galloping horses and wide-open skies. The dawn broke gray and misty over Millbrook, the aftermath of the storm leaving the world washed clean and new. At the orphanage, the day began as it always did, with the clanging of the breakfast bell and the shuffling of sleepy children making their way to the dining hall. But there was an undercurrent of excitement, a buzz of whispered conversations and furtive glances. Ethan, rubbing sleep from his eyes, caught snatches of hushed words as he queued for his porridge. "Did you hear it? In the night, I swear I saw something. The gate was open this morning. I heard Ms. Bell saying." Curiosity piqued. Ethan craned his neck, trying to see out of the smudged windows. What had happened during the night? What had the others seen or heard? His heart beat a little faster at the thought of something, anything, breaking the monotony of orphanage life. As the children filed out after breakfast, Ethan hung back, slipping away from the group heading to morning lessons. He made his way to the back door, easing it open just enough to peek out into the courtyard. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. There, standing in the middle of the muddy yard, was the most magnificent horse Ethan had ever seen. Its coat was a deep, rich brown, almost black, gleaming with health despite the dampness of the morning. Its mane and tail flowed like silk, and its eyes were full of intelligence and something Ethan could only describe as understanding. For a long moment, boy and horse stood frozen, regarding each other across the rain-puddled expanse of the courtyard. Then, slowly, deliberately, the horse took a step towards Ethan. Another, and another. Ethan's heart raced. He should run, he knew. He should call for Ms. Bell or one of the other staff, but he couldn't move, couldn't look away from those deep, knowing eyes. The horse stopped a few feet away from Ethan, lowering its great head to his level. Ethan could feel its warm breath on his face, could see his own reflection in its liquid eyes. Trembling, he raised a hand, fingers outstretched. "Hello," he whispered, barely audible. "Where did you come from?" As if in answer, the horse nickered softly, nudging Ethan's hand with its velvety muzzle. The touch sent a jolt through Ethan, a feeling of connection unlike anything he'd ever experienced. In that moment, all his loneliness, all his years of feeling unwanted and unloved, seemed to melt away. "Ethan!" Ms. Bell's sharp voice shattered the moment. "Get away from that animal at once!" Startled, Ethan stumbled backward as Ms. Bell came hurrying across the courtyard, her face a mask of concern and annoyance. The horse tossed its head, taking a few prancing steps away, but it didn't bolt. Instead, it stood its ground, watching the proceedings with what Ethan could have sworn was amusement. "I don't know how that creature got in here," Miss Bell muttered, grabbing Ethan's arm and pulling him towards the door. "But it's dangerous. Wild animals have no place in an orphanage. I'll have to call animal control." "No!" Ethan cried, surprising himself with the force of his objection. "Please, Ms. Bell, he's not dangerous. He's friendly. Look." As if on cue, the horse approached again, this time dropping to its knees in a gesture so human-like that Ms. Bell's mouth fell open in shock. It stayed there, looking from Ethan to Ms. Bell and back again, as if waiting for their next move. "Well, I never," Ms. Bell breathed, her grip on Ethan's arm loosening. "In all my years." Seizing his chance, Ethan pulled free and ran to the horse, throwing his arms around its muscular neck. He buried his face in its mane, breathing in the scent of freedom and wild places. "Please," he said, turning tear-filled eyes to Miss Bell. "Please, can he stay? Just for a little while?" Ms. Bell stood frozen, clearly torn between her duty to keep the children safe and the extraordinary scene before her. Finally, she sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "One day," she said firmly. "He can stay in the old stable for one day while we try to find his owner. But after that, Ethan, he has to go. Do you understand?" Ethan nodded eagerly, his heart soaring. One day might not seem like much, but to a boy who had never had anything to call his own, it was a lifetime. As Ms. Bell turned to go back inside, muttering about paperwork and regulations, Ethan turned back to his new friend. "You need a name," he said softly, running his hand along the horse's sleek neck. "Something special." He thought for a moment, remembering the feeling he'd had when he first touched the horse, the sense of possibilities opening up before him. "Freedom," he decided. "I'll call you Freedom." Freedom nickered softly, as if approving the choice. As Ethan led him towards the old stable, he felt a warmth spreading through his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. It was hope, he realized. Hope and the first stirrings of joy. Little did Ethan know that this was just the beginning. Freedom's arrival was about to set in motion a chain of events that would change not just Ethan's life, but the lives of everyone at Millbrook Orphanage. As the sun broke through the clouds, casting a golden glow over the courtyard, it seemed to Ethan that the whole world was filled with new possibilities. For the first time in his young life, Ethan felt the stirrings of a great adventure beginning. And as he settled Freedom into the stable, murmuring promises to return soon, he couldn't shake the feeling that this magnificent creature had come into his life for a reason. Whatever that reason was, Ethan was determined to find out. The days that followed Freedom's arrival were unlike anything Ethan had ever experienced at the orphanage. The old stable, long unused and nearly forgotten, became a sanctuary, a place where the harsh realities of orphanage life seemed to fade away, replaced by the quiet companionship of boy and horse. Ethan spent every spare moment with Freedom, sneaking away between lessons and chores to brush the horse's gleaming coat or simply sit in comfortable silence, sharing an apple or carrot smuggled from the kitchen. To Ethan's amazement and delight, Freedom seemed to understand him in a way no human ever had. When Ethan spoke of his fears and dreams, the horse would listen intently, sometimes offering a gentle nicker or a soft nuzzle as if in response. The change in Ethan didn't go unnoticed. The other children, once content to ignore the quiet, withdrawn boy, now watched him with curiosity and a touch of envy. Ethan walked with his head a little higher, his shoulders a little straighter. There was a light in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a spark of life that drew others to him like moths to a flame. Ms. Bell, too, observed the transformation with a mixture of wonder and concern. She had seen too many children build up hopes only to have them dashed, had watched too many times as the light of expectation faded from young eyes. Yet she couldn't deny the positive effect Freedom was having on Ethan and, by extension, on the entire orphanage. One evening, as the golden light of sunset bathed the courtyard in warm hues, Ms. Bell found Ethan sitting on a bale of hay outside the stable, sketching Freedom as the horse grazed nearby. "He really is quite remarkable," she said, startling Ethan, who hadn't heard her approach. Ethan nodded, a smile spreading across his face. "He's the best friend I've ever had," he said simply. Mrs. Bell settled herself on the hay bale next to Ethan, her usual stern demeanor softening as she watched the horse. "You know," she said after a moment, "when I was about your age, I had a horse of my own, not nearly as magnificent as your Freedom, of course, but she was special to me." Ethan looked up in surprise. It was rare for Ms. Belle to share anything personal, and he found himself hanging on her every word. "What was her name?" he asked. "Starlight," Miss Belle replied, a faraway look in her eyes. She was a dapple gray, and when the moonlight hit her just right, she seemed to glow like a constellation come to life. For a moment, Ethan saw Ms. Belle not as the strict orphanage director, but as a girl not so different from himself, a child with dreams and a love for horses. It was a revelation that shifted his entire perception of her. "What happened to her?" Ethan asked softly. Ms. Belle sighed, the wistful expression fading from her face. "Life happened, Ethan. We grow up. We move on. Sometimes we have to leave behind the things we love." She turned to look at him, her eyes serious. "That's why I worry about you and Freedom. I don't want to see you hurt when it's time for him to go." Ethan felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He had been pushing away thoughts of Freedom leaving, pretending that their time together could last forever. But Ms. Belle's words brought reality crashing back. "He doesn't have to go," Ethan said, a note of desperation creeping into his voice. "No one's come to claim him. He could stay here, with me. I'd take care of him. I promise." Ms. Belle shook her head gently. "Ethan, you know that's not possible. An orphanage is no place for a horse, especially one as special as Freedom. He needs wide-open spaces, room to run, and you need a family, a real home." Tears welled up in Ethan's eyes, and he turned away, not wanting Ms. Belle to see him cry. He felt a warm hand on his shoulder, a gesture of comfort so unexpected from the usually distant Ms. Belle that it only made the tears fall faster. "I know it's hard," she said softly. "But sometimes, Ethan, the most important lessons we learn in life come from letting go. Freedom has brought you something precious. He's helped you open your heart. Don't close it again when he leaves. Keep it open, and you might be surprised at what comes into your life next." With a final pat on his shoulder, Ms. Belle stood and walked back towards the orphanage, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts and the comforting presence of Freedom. As the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, Ethan made his way to Freedom's side. He buried his face in the horse's mane, inhaling the scent that had come to mean safety and companionship. "I won't let them take you away," he whispered fiercely. "I promise, Freedom. We'll find a way to stay together." Freedom nickered softly, nuzzling Ethan's hair as if in reassurance. And in that moment, as the first stars began to twinkle overhead, Ethan felt a surge of determination. He didn't know how, but he would find a way to keep his promise. Freedom had given him hope, had shown him what it felt like to be truly seen and understood. Ethan wasn't about to let that go without a fight. As he made his way back to the dormitory that night, Ethan's mind raced with half-formed plans and wild ideas. He didn't notice the sleek black car parked just outside the orphanage gates, or the man watching the building with keen interest from behind tinted windows. Change was coming to Millbrook Orphanage, faster and more dramatically than anyone could have imagined. And at the center of it all was a boy and his horse, unknowing catalysts in a story that was about to take an unexpected turn. The black car remained parked outside the gates long after Ethan had disappeared into the orphanage. Inside, a man with sharp features and cold eyes studied a file spread open on his lap. The dim glow of a tablet illuminated his face, casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance across his skin. "Ethan Brooks," he murmured, tracing a finger over the boy's photograph. 10 years old. No known relatives. Perfect. He tapped the tablet, and a new image appeared, a grainy security camera shot of Ethan and Freedom in the courtyard. The man's lips curled into a smile that held no warmth. "And what do we have here? Quite the unexpected complication. But perhaps this could work to our advantage." With a decisive nod, he closed the file and powered down the tablet. As he started the car's engine, his phone buzzed with an incoming message. "Everything is in place," it read. "Proceed as planned." The car pulled away from the curb, melting into the darkness of the country road, but its presence had not gone entirely unnoticed. In her office, the light still burning despite the late hour, Ms. Bell stood at the window, a frown creasing her brow. She had seen the car, had felt the prickle of unease at its prolonged presence. Something was coming. She could feel it in her bones. But what? With a sigh, she turned back to her desk, where a stack of papers awaited her attention. On top was a letter she had been avoiding all day, an inquiry about Ethan from a potential adoptive family. Under normal circumstances, such interest would be cause for celebration, but these were not normal circumstances. Mrs. Bell sank into her chair, her mind whirling with conflicting emotions. She thought of Ethan's transformation since Freedom's arrival, the joy that radiated from him whenever he was with the horse, and she thought of her own long-buried dreams of a young girl and her beloved Starlight. "What's the right thing to do?" she whispered to the empty room. For once, the answer wasn't clear. As the night deepened, the orphanage settled into silence, but it was a silence pregnant with possibility, with whispers of change carried on the cool night breeze. In the old stable, Freedom stood alert, his ears pricked forward as if listening to voices only he could hear. And in his bed, Ethan dreamed of wide-open spaces and the thundering of hooves, unaware that his life was poised on the brink of an adventure beyond his wildest imaginings. The dawn would bring with it new challenges, new dangers, and new hopes. For Ethan and Freedom, for Ms. Bell and the mysterious man in the black car, the stage was set for a drama that would test the bonds of friendship, the limits of courage, and the power of love to overcome even the darkest of intentions. As the first hints of light began to streak the eastern sky, a restless energy seemed to pulse through the very walls of Millbrook Orphanage. The day ahead would change everything, for better or for worse remained to be seen. The following days at Millbrook Orphanage unfolded with an air of anticipation, like the calm before a storm. Ethan, oblivious to the undercurrents of tension, continued to spend every available moment with Freedom. The bond between boy and horse grew stronger with each passing day, a connection so profound it seemed to transcend words. It was on a crisp autumn morning, as golden leaves swirled in the courtyard, that the black car returned. This time, it didn't remain outside the gates. It pulled up the long driveway, gravel crunching under its tires, and came to a stop before the main entrance. Ethan, who had been mucking out Freedom's stable, paused at the sound. He peered around the stable door, curiosity piqued by the unusual visitor. The car's back door opened, and a man stepped out, tall, impeccably dressed in a suit that seemed too fine for their rural setting. There was something about him, a sleekness that reminded Ethan of a predator, that sent a shiver down his spine. Miss Bell emerged from the orphanage, her face a careful mask of professional courtesy. But Ethan, who had learned to read her subtle expressions, saw the tightness around her eyes, the slight downturn of her mouth that betrayed her unease. "Mr. Blackwood," Ms. Bell said, extending her hand, "welcome to Millbrook Orphanage. I must say, your interest in our little establishment comes as quite a surprise." The man, Mr. Blackwood, smiled, a gesture that didn't reach his eyes. "Ms. Bell, a pleasure. I assure you, my interest is entirely genuine. I've heard wonderful things about the work you do here." As the adults disappeared into the building, Ethan felt a knot of anxiety form in his stomach. He didn't know why, but something about Mr. Blackwood's presence felt wrong, like a discordant note in a familiar melody. Freedom nickered softly, drawing Ethan's attention back to the stable. The horse's dark eyes seemed to reflect Ethan's own unease. "It's okay, boy," Ethan murmured, stroking Freedom's velvet nose. "Everything's going to be fine." But even as he spoke the words, Ethan wasn't sure he believed them. The peace he had found in Freedom's company suddenly felt fragile, threatened by forces he didn't understand. Inside the orphanage, in Mrs. Bell's cluttered office, a conversation was unfolding that would set in motion a chain of events that would change Ethan's life forever. "I'll be direct, Miss Bell," Mr. Blackwood said, leaning forward in his chair. "I'm interested in adopting one of your children. Specifically, I'm interested in Ethan Brooks, Ms." Bell's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Ethan, I see. May I ask why you're interested in him particularly?" Mr. Blackwood's smile widened, showing too many teeth. "Let's just say I have a feeling about the boy. Something tells me he and I would be a good fit." Ms. Bell felt a chill run down her spine. There was something in Mr. Blackwood's tone, a hint of something cold and calculating, that set off alarm bells in her mind. But what could she do? On paper, Mr. Blackwood was a perfect candidate. Wealthy, well-connected, with glowing references that spoke of his philanthropic work. "Of course," she said slowly, "any adoption would need to go through the proper channels. There are home visits to arrange, paperwork to file." "Naturally," Mr. Blackwood cut in smoothly. "And I assure you, everything will be in order. I have friends in high places, Ms. Bell. I'm confident we can expedite the process." As the conversation continued, Ms. Bell felt increasingly uneasy. Everything Mr. Blackwood said was correct, proper, above board. And yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Outside, unaware of the discussion that would shape his future, Ethan had returned to his task of cleaning the stable. But his movements were distracted, his mind whirling with questions. Who was the man in the fancy car? Why was he here? And why did his presence fill Ethan with such dread? As he worked, Ethan found himself talking to Freedom, voicing his fears and uncertainties to the one friend he trusted completely. "I don't want anything to change," he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm happy here, with you. For the first time, I feel like I belong somewhere. I don't want to lose that." Freedom nickered softly, as if in understanding. He stretched his neck over the stable door, gently nuzzling Ethan's hair. In that moment, Ethan made a decision. No matter what happened, no matter who came or went, he would not let anyone separate him from Freedom. They were a team now, bound by a connection that went beyond words or reason. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in vibrant oranges and pinks, the black car finally pulled away from the orphanage. Ethan watched it go from his favorite spot by the stable, a mixture of relief and apprehension swirling in his chest. The car's departure didn't feel like an end, but rather the beginning of something new and potentially frightening. That night, as Ethan lay in his narrow bed listening to the soft breathing of the other children, he couldn't shake the feeling that his world was about to change dramatically. In the darkness, he clung to the memory of Freedom's strength and warmth, drawing courage from the bond they shared. Little did Ethan know that miles away, in a luxurious office overlooking the city, Mr. Blackwood was making plans of his own. Plans that would test Ethan's courage, challenge his loyalty, and ultimately reveal the true power of the connection between a boy and his horse. As the night deepened, two hearts beat in sync, one in a crowded orphanage dormitory, the other in a lonely stable. Boy and horse, each drawing strength from the other, stood poised on the brink of an adventure neither could have imagined. The stage was set, the players in position. All that remained was for the curtain to rise on the next act of their extraordinary tale. The days following Mr. Blackwood's visit passed in a blur of nervous energy and whispered conversations. Ethan, sensing the change in the air, clung ever more tightly to his time with freedom. The old stable became his refuge, a place where the uncertainties of the outside world seemed to fade away. It was on a blustery afternoon, with dark clouds gathering on the horizon, that Ms. Bell called Ethan into her office. Her face was grave, her eyes filled with a sadness that made Ethan's heart clench with fear. "Ethan," she began, her voice gentle, "I need to talk to you about something important. Do you remember the man who visited us last week, Mr. Blackwood?" Ethan nodded, a cold knot forming in his stomach. "Well," Ms. Bell continued, "he's expressed an interest in adopting you. He's completed all the necessary paperwork, and he'll be coming to take you to your new home tomorrow." The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. He stumbled backward, shaking his head in disbelief. "No," he whispered. "No, I don't want to go. I want to stay here. I want to stay with freedom." Mrs. Bell's face crumpled with sympathy. "Oh, Ethan, I know how much freedom means to you, but you must understand. This is an opportunity for you to have a real home, a family. Isn't that what you've always wanted?" But Ethan wasn't listening. His mind was racing, filled with images of leaving the orphanage, leaving freedom behind. It was unthinkable, unbearable. "You can't make me go," he cried, tears streaming down his face. "I won't leave freedom. I promised him we'd stay together." Before Ms. Bell could respond, Ethan turned and fled from the office. He ran through the halls of the orphanage, past startled children and concerned staff, out into the courtyard where the wind whipped at his clothes and tore at his hair. He didn't stop until he reached the stable, throwing himself into Freedom's stall and burying his face in the horse's mane. Freedom nickered softly, sensing Ethan's distress, and curved his neck around the boy in a protective embrace. "They want to take me away," Ethan sobbed, his words muffled against Freedom's warm coat. "But I won't go. I can't leave you. You're the only one who's ever really understood me." As the storm broke overhead, rain lashing against the stable roof, Ethan's mind whirled with desperate plans. He couldn't leave. Wouldn't leave. But what could he do? Where could he go? It was then, in his darkest moment, that Ethan remembered something. Ms. Bell had said long ago, on that first day when freedom had appeared in the courtyard. She had spoken of wide-open spaces, of a horse's need for room to run. Slowly, an idea began to form in Ethan's mind. It was crazy, dangerous even. But as another crack of thunder shook the stable, Ethan knew it was his only choice. With shaking hands, he began to gather what he would need: a rope for a makeshift halter, a blanket to serve as a saddle. His heart pounded in his chest, a mixture of fear and exhilaration coursing through his veins. "We're leaving freedom," he whispered, stroking the horse's nose. "Tonight, just you and me. We'll find those wide-open spaces Ms. Bell talked about. We'll be free." Freedom's ears pricked forward, his dark eyes seeming to shine with understanding. As Ethan worked, securing the blanket and fashioning a halter from the rope, the horse stood perfectly still, as if sensing the importance of the moment. Night fell, the storm still raging outside. Ethan waited, every nerve on edge, until the orphanage fell silent. Then, moving as quietly as he could, he led Freedom from the stable. The rain soaked them both in seconds, but Ethan hardly noticed. With a grace born of desperation, he swung himself onto Freedom's back. For a moment, they stood there in the courtyard, boy and horse united in their quest for freedom. Then, with a soft word from Ethan, Freedom began to move, slowly at first, then faster, his powerful legs eating up the ground. They passed through the gates of the orphanage, out onto the country road beyond. As they galloped into the night, the wind and rain lashing at them, Ethan felt a wild joy surge through him. He had no idea where they were going, what dangers lay ahead, but he was with freedom, and for the first time in his life, he felt truly, completely free. Behind them, the lights of the orphanage faded into the distance. Ahead lay uncertainty, adventure, and the promise of a bond that could overcome any obstacle. Boy and horse, silhouetted against the storm-tossed sky, rode on into legend. Little did they know that their adventure was only beginning, and that the true test of their courage and loyalty still lay ahead. For in the morning, when their absence was discovered, wheels would be set in motion that would change not just their lives, but the lives of everyone at Millbrook Orphanage. As dawn broke over the countryside, painting the rain-washed world in soft pinks and golds, Ethan and Freedom found themselves in a landscape transformed. The familiar fields and forests around Millbrook had given way to rolling hills and winding streams. They had ridden through the night, driven by a mixture of fear and exhilaration, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the life they had left behind. Ethan, exhausted but exhilarated, guided Freedom to a secluded meadow bordered by a bubbling creek. As they came to a stop, the reality of what he had done began to sink in. He was alone, save for Freedom, in a world much larger and more complex than he had ever imagined. "We did it, boy," he whispered, sliding from Freedom's back on shaky legs. "We're free." Freedom nickered softly, nuzzling Ethan's hair as if in agreement. But as the adrenaline of their escape began to fade, new worries crept in. Where would they go? How would they survive? And what would happen when people started looking for them? As if in answer to his unspoken fears, the distant sound of a helicopter broke the morning stillness. Ethan's heart leapt into his throat. Had they been found already? How was that possible? Panicked, he led Freedom into the shelter of the nearby trees, his mind racing. He hadn't thought beyond escaping, hadn't planned for what came next. Now, faced with the reality of life on the run, Ethan felt a wave of doubt wash over him. But as he looked into Freedom's trusting eyes, he felt his resolve strengthen. They had come this far together. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it as a team. "We'll be okay," he murmured, as much to himself as to Freedom. "We'll find a way." Little did Ethan know that back at Millbrook Orphanage, a drama was unfolding that would have far-reaching consequences for everyone involved in his story. Ms. Belle, awakened by the commotion of Ethan's discovered absence, stood in the rain-soaked courtyard, her face a mask of worry and guilt. She should have seen this coming, should have recognized the desperation in Ethan's eyes when she told him about the adoption. Now, as the first rays of dawn painted the sky, she faced the consequences of her oversight. How could this happen? Mr. Blackwood's voice cut through the air, sharp with anger and something else, a cold calculation that sent shivers down Ms. Bell's spine. He had arrived moments after the alarm was raised, his pristine suit incongruous in the muddy chaos of the orphanage grounds. Ms. Belle turned to face him, straightening her shoulders despite the weight of guilt pressing down on her. "Mr. Blackwood, I assure you, we're doing everything in our power to find Ethan. I've already contacted the authorities and—" "The authorities," Mr. Blackwood scoffed, his eyes glinting dangerously. "My dear Ms. Bell, I'm afraid this situation requires a more specialized approach." Before Ms. Bell could respond, Mr. Blackwood pulled out his phone and stepped away, speaking in low, urgent tones to someone on the other end. Ms. Bell watched him, a growing sense of unease twisting in her gut. There was more going on here than a simple adoption gone awry. Of that, she was certain. As if to confirm her suspicions, a sleek black SUV pulled up to the orphanage gates, followed closely by a van marked with the logo of a local news station. Mr. Blackwood's lips curled into a smile that held no warmth as he strode to meet the newcomers. "Miss Bell," he called over his shoulder, "I believe you'll want to be present for this. After all, the public will want answers about how a child could simply vanish from your care." The implied threat in his words was clear. Mrs. Bell felt her world tilting on its axis, years of dedicated service and care for the children of Millbrook Orphanage suddenly at risk of crumbling around her. But as she watched Mr. Blackwood greet the men from the SUV, men whose bearing screamed private security, a new determination sparked within her. Ethan was out there, alone and afraid. Whatever game Mr. Blackwood was playing, whatever his true motives might be, Ms. Bell knew one thing with absolute certainty. She had to protect Ethan, no matter the cost to herself. As reporters began to gather, and Mr. Blackwood prepared to give a statement, Ms. Bell slipped away, her mind racing. She had to find Ethan first, had to warn him of the storm that was brewing. But how? In her office, door locked against the chaos outside, Ms. Bell sank into her chair and closed her eyes, thinking back to all her conversations with Ethan about freedom. Where would a boy and a horse go if they were seeking safety? What clues had she missed? Her eyes snapped open, landing on an old photograph on her desk, a young girl astride a dapple gray horse, eyes shining with joy. Starlight. The memory of her own childhood, of whispered dreams of freedom and adventure, washed over her. "Oh, Ethan," she murmured, a plan beginning to form in her mind. "I understand now, and I promise I'll make this right." Outside, Mr. Blackwood's voice rose above the clamor of questions from the gathered reporters. "A tragic situation, but I assure you, no expense will be spared in bringing young Ethan home safely. My team of experts is already on the case." Ms. Bell tuned out his words, focusing instead on the task ahead. She knew she was risking everything, her career, her reputation, perhaps even her freedom. But as she thought of Ethan and freedom, out there facing who knew what dangers, she knew she had no choice. Grabbing her coat and car keys, Ms. Bell took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. As she slipped out the back door of the orphanage, unnoticed in the commotion out front, she sent up a silent prayer. "Hold on, Ethan," she whispered to the wind. "Help is on the way." Little did Ms. Bell know that her actions were about to set in motion a chain of events that would not only change her life and Ethan's, but would uncover secrets long buried and challenge the very foundations of Millbrook Orphanage. As she drove away, the sky darkening with the promise of another storm, the true adventure was only just beginning. Chapter 6. Allies and Adversaries. As Ethan and Freedom pushed deeper into unfamiliar territory, the world around them seemed to grow larger and more complex with each passing hour. The initial exhilaration of their escape had given way to a gnawing anxiety as the realities of life on the run began to sink in. They had been traveling for days, staying off main roads and foraging for what food they could find. Ethan's clothes were dirty and torn, his stomach hollow with hunger. But every time he looked at Freedom, saw the trust and determination in those liquid brown eyes, he found the strength to keep going. It was on the evening of their third day of freedom that they stumbled upon the old barn. Nestled in a forgotten corner of a sprawling farm, its weathered boards and sagging roof promised shelter from the elements and prying eyes. Ethan led Freedom inside, the musty scent of old hay and aged wood filling his nostrils. As he settled Freedom into one of the empty stalls, Ethan allowed himself to relax for the first time in days. They were safe, at least for the moment, but their reprieve was short-lived. As night fell and Ethan curled up in the hay beside Freedom, the sound of approaching vehicles shattered the peaceful silence. Headlights swept across the barn walls, voices carrying on the night air. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he peered through a crack in the barn wall. What he saw made his blood run cold. There, emerging from a sleek black SUV, was Mr. Blackwood. "Search every inch of this property." Mr. Blackwood's voice carried clearly in the still night air. "The boy can't have gotten far, not on foot." Ethan turned to Freedom, panic rising in his throat. They had to get out, had to run. But before he could move, a hand clamped over his mouth, stifling his startled cry. "Shh," a familiar voice whispered in his ear. "It's me, Ethan. It's Ms. Bell." Ethan went limp with relief, turning to find Ms. Bell crouched beside him, her finger to her lips in a gesture of silence. Her usual neat appearance was disheveled, her eyes wild with a mixture of fear and determination. "Miss Bell," Ethan whispered when she removed her hand. "How did you find us? What's going on?" Ms. Bell's eyes darted to the barn door, where shadows moved as Blackwood's men began their search. "There's no time to explain everything now," she said urgently. "But you need to know, Mr. Blackwood is not who he claims to be. He's dangerous, Ethan. We have to get you out of here." The gravity in her voice sent chills down Ethan's spine. He had sensed something off about Mr. Blackwood from the beginning, but to hear Ms. Bell confirm his fears was terrifying. "But how?" Ethan asked, gesturing helplessly to Freedom. "We can't exactly sneak out unnoticed." A small smile tugged at Miss Bell's lips, a glimmer of the warmth Ethan remembered from their conversations about Starlight. "Who said anything about sneaking?" she whispered. "Sometimes, Ethan, the best way out is right through the front door, or in this case, perhaps right over their heads." As Ms. Bell outlined her audacious plan, Ethan felt a mixture of terror and exhilaration building inside him. It was crazy, dangerous, and probably impossible. But as he looked from Ms. Bell's determined face to Freedom's trusting eyes, he knew it was their only chance. Outside, Mr. Blackwood's voice rose in frustration as his men reported another empty building. "He has to be here somewhere," he snarled. "Find him!" Inside the barn, Ethan took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. He swung himself onto Freedom's back, feeling the horse's muscles tense beneath him, ready for action. Ms. Bell stood by Freedom's head, her hand on his neck, her eyes meeting Ethan's in a silent question. "Are you ready?" Ethan nodded, his jaw set with determination. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. Boy, horse, and the unlikely ally they had found in Ms. Bell. As Ms. Bell threw open the barn doors, flooding the interior with moonlight, Ethan leaned low over Freedom's neck and whispered the words that would change everything. "Now, Freedom." "Run!" And with that, they burst from the barn, a thundering whirlwind of hooves and hope, charging headlong into a night alive with danger and possibility. The shouts of surprise from Blackwood's men, the roar of engines starting up, all faded into background noise as Ethan focused on the rhythm of Freedom's gallop and the wind rushing past his face. They were racing not just for their freedom now, but for their very lives. And as the barn receded into the distance, Ethan knew that this was only the beginning of their true adventure. Behind them, Miss Bell watched their retreat, a mixture of pride and fear warring in her heart. She turned to face the approaching figures of Mr. Blackwood and his men, squaring her shoulders for the confrontation to come. She had chosen her side, cast her lot in with Ethan and Freedom. Whatever the cost, she would see this through. As the night exploded into chaos around them, 3 hearts beat as one, a boy, a horse, and a woman who had rediscovered her own courage. The true test of their strength, their loyalty, and their love was only just beginning. Chapter 7. Secrets Unveiled. The dawn broke cold and gray, a fitting backdrop for the tension that hung heavy in the air. Ethan and Freedom had ridden through the night, pushing themselves to the limit of endurance. Now, as the first weak rays of sunlight pierced the morning mist, they found themselves in a dense forest, the trees offering a temporary haven from their pursuers. Ethan slid from Freedom's back, his legs shaky with exhaustion. Every muscle ached, and his mind whirled with questions. What did Mr. Blackwood want with him? Why had Ms. Bell risked everything to help them escape? And most pressingly, where could they go now? As if sensing his turmoil, Freedom nudged Ethan's shoulder gently. Ethan leaned against the horse's solid warmth, drawing comfort from the steadfast presence of his friend. "We'll figure this out, boy," he murmured, more to reassure himself than Freedom. "We've come this far. We can't give up now." A twig snapped nearby, and Ethan tensed, ready to leap back onto Freedom's back at a moment's notice. But the figure that emerged from the underbrush was not one of Blackwood's men. It was an old woman, her face weathered by time and the elements, her eyes bright with a wisdom that seemed to pierce right through Ethan. Well, she said, her voice creaky but kind. "What have we here?" A boy and his horse, far from home by the looks of it. Ethan hesitated, torn between the ingrained caution of his years in the orphanage and a strange sense that this woman could be trusted. We're lost," he said finally, the half-truth sticking in his throat. The old woman's eyes twinkled with knowing amusement. "Lost, are you? Or perhaps running from something, or someone?" Before Ethan could respond, the woman held up a gnarled hand. "No need to explain, child. I can see it in your eyes. Come, both of you. My cottage is not far, and you look like you could use a warm meal and a safe place to rest." Every instinct screamed at Ethan to be cautious, to politely refuse and keep moving. But exhaustion and hunger won out. With a nod to Freedom, who seemed oddly at ease in the old woman's presence, Ethan followed her deeper into the forest. The cottage, when they reached it, was like something out of a fairy tale. Nestled in a clearing, its thatched roof and stone walls seemed to grow organically from the forest floor. Smoke curled invitingly from the chimney, and the scent of freshly baked bread wafted on the air. As Ethan settled Freedom in a small paddock beside the cottage, the old woman busied herself inside. Soon, Ethan found himself seated at a rough-hewn table, a bowl of hearty stew and a chunk of warm bread before him. "Eat," the woman encouraged, settling herself across from him. "And then, perhaps, you'll feel up to sharing your story." Ethan ate ravenously, the warmth of the stew seeming to chase away not just the chill in his bones, but some of the fear that had been his constant companion since fleeing the orphanage. When he had finished, he looked up to find the old woman regarding him with patient expectation. Taking a deep breath, Ethan began to speak. He told her everything about life in the orphanage, Freedom's miraculous appearance, Mr. Blackwood's sinister interest, and their daring escape. As he spoke, the old woman listened intently, her expression shifting from concern to anger to something like recognition. When Ethan finished, silence fell over the cottage. The old woman sat back in her chair, her eyes distant as if seeing something far beyond the confines of the small room. "I had wondered if this day would come," she said finally, her voice heavy with an emotion Ethan couldn't quite place. "Tell me, child, what do you know of your parents?" Ethan blinked, taken aback by the sudden change in subject. My parents. Nothing, really. I was left at the orphanage as a baby." "Why?" The old woman leaned forward, her eyes boring into Ethan's with an intensity that made him want to squirm. Because, my dear boy, I think it's time you learned the truth about your parents, about Mr. Blackwood, and about the remarkable horse that has come into your life. As the old woman began to speak, Ethan felt the world shift around him. The tale she wove was one of love and loss, of betrayal and hidden legacies. His parents, she revealed, had not abandoned him, but had been forced to leave him at the orphanage to protect him from those who sought to exploit a secret that Ethan now carried in his very blood. Your father, the old woman explained, her voice soft with memory, was a brilliant scientist. He discovered something extraordinary, a way to communicate with animals on a level never before achieved. But there were those who wanted to use his discovery for nefarious purposes. Your parents went into hiding, but not before ensuring you were safe. Ethan's mind reeled. Could it be true? Could this explain the inexplicable bond he felt with freedom? But what does this have to do with Mr. Blackwood? He asked, his voice trembling. The old woman's face darkened. Blackwood was once your father's partner, but he became consumed by greed, by the potential for power that your father's discovery represented. He's been searching for you for years, hoping to use you to unlock the secrets your father left behind. As the full weight of the revelation settled over Ethan, he felt a curious mixture of fear and exhilaration. Suddenly, his connection to freedom, the sense of belonging he'd felt from the moment the horse appeared in the orphanage courtyard, it all made sense. It wasn't just chance or luck that had brought them together. It was destiny, written in the very fabric of his being. But how? Ethan stammered, his mind whirling with questions. How did freedom find me? And why now? The old woman's eyes twinkled with a mixture of wisdom and mischief. Ah, now that's the real magic of it all, isn't it? Your father's work wasn't just about communication, you see. It was about connection, a deep, primal link between humans and animals that goes beyond words or conscious thought. And you, my dear boy, are the key to unlocking that connection fully. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Freedom didn't just find you by chance. He was drawn to you, called by the very essence of who you are. And as for why now? She paused, her expression growing serious. I fear it's because the danger your parents sought to protect you from is growing. Blackwood's desperation is making him reckless, and that makes him more dangerous than ever. Ethan sat back, feeling as if the world had tilted on its axis. Everything he thought he knew about himself, about his life, had been turned upside down. And yet, as he processed the old woman's words, he felt a strange sense of rightness settling over him. It was as if a missing piece of himself had finally slotted into place. What do I do now? He asked, his voice small in the face of the enormous reality he was grappling with. The old woman reached across the table, taking Ethan's hand in her gnarled one. Her touch was warm, comforting, grounding him in the midst of his whirling thoughts. Now, my brave boy, you embrace who you truly are. You learn to harness the gift that runs in your blood. And most importantly, you prepare yourself for the challenges that lie ahead. For make no mistake, Blackwood will not give up easily. He will come for you, and when he does, you must be ready. As if on cue, a whinny from outside drew their attention. Ethan rushed to the window to see Freedom prancing in the small paddock, his ears pricked forward and his eyes alert. It was as if the horse could sense the momentous conversation happening inside the cottage. He knows, Ethan breathed, a smile tugging at his lips despite the gravity of the situation. Somehow, he knows we're talking about him. The old woman joined him at the window, her eyes soft as she watched Freedom. Of course he does. The bond between you is stronger than you can imagine, and it will only grow stronger as you learn to use your gift." She turned to Ethan, her expression serious once more. "But we don't have much time. Blackwood and his men won't be far behind, and we need to prepare you as best we can before they catch up." Ethan nodded, a determination settling over him that he'd never felt before. He was no longer just a lost orphan boy running from a threat he didn't understand. He was the inheritor of a remarkable legacy, the keeper of a secret that could change the world. And he had freedom by his side, a partner, a protector, a living embodiment of the gift that flowed through his veins. "Teach me," he said simply, meeting the old woman's gaze with newfound confidence. "Teach me everything." The next few days passed in a whirlwind of activity. The old woman, who finally introduced herself as Mara, proved to be a fountain of knowledge about Ethan's father's work. She had been a colleague of his parents, she explained, one of the few who knew the true nature of their research. Each morning, Ethan would wake at dawn, spending hours with freedom in the small meadow behind Mara's cottage. Under her guidance, he learned to quiet his mind, to reach out with senses he never knew he possessed. At first, it was frustrating. He could feel something there, just beyond his reach, but he couldn't quite grasp it. But then, on the third day, something shifted. As Ethan stood with his hand on Freedom's neck, eyes closed in concentration, he felt a sudden rush of something. It was as if a door had opened in his mind, and through it poured a torrent of sensation and emotion that wasn't his own. He gasped, his eyes flying open to meet Freedom's gaze, and in that moment, he understood. He could feel Freedom's exhilaration at the gallop, his contentment in the quiet moments they shared, his fierce protectiveness towards Ethan. It was overwhelming, exhilarating, and more than a little terrifying. I can feel him," Ethan whispered, tears pricking at his eyes. "I can feel everything he's feeling." Mara, watching from the edge of the meadow, nodded in satisfaction. "That's it, child. That's the gift awakening in you. But remember, this is just the beginning. You must learn to control it, to direct it, for with great power comes great responsibility." As the days passed, Ethan's control grew. He learned to initiate the connection at will, to sift through the rush of sensations and emotions to find specific thoughts or memories. And more than that, he began to understand how to project his own thoughts and feelings to Freedom. It wasn't just communication. It was a true melding of minds, a sharing of selves that went beyond anything Ethan had ever imagined possible. With each passing day, the bond between boy and horse grew stronger, deeper, more intricate. But even as Ethan reveled in his newfound abilities, a sense of urgency hung over the cottage. Mara pushed him hard, insisting that he practice for hours each day. And in the quiet moments, when Ethan was supposed to be resting, he could see the worry in her eyes as she pored over old journals and muttered to herself. It was on the 5th day that everything changed. Ethan was in the meadow with Freedom, deep in a shared meditation that Mara had taught them. In this state, their minds were so closely entwined that it was hard to tell where Ethan ended and Freedom began. Suddenly, a spike of alarm shot through their shared consciousness. Freedom's head jerked up, his nostrils flaring as he scented the air. And through their connection, Ethan understood immediately what had triggered the horse's reaction. "They're coming," he said, his voice tight with fear as he turned to Mara. "Blackwood and his men. They've found us." Mara's face paled, but she nodded grimly. "I had hoped we'd have more time," she said, already moving towards the cottage. "But we've prepared as best we could. Now it's time to put your training to the test." As Mara disappeared into the cottage, presumably to gather whatever supplies she deemed essential. Ethan turned to Freedom. The horse was tense, ready for action, and through their bond, Ethan could feel his determination to protect his human friend at all costs. "We can do this," Ethan murmured, as much to himself as to Freedom. "Together, we can face anything." He swung himself onto Freedom's back, marveling as always at how natural it felt, how perfectly they moved as one. As Mara emerged from the cottage, a packed bag slung over her shoulder, Ethan reached down to help her up behind him. "Remember everything I've taught you," Mara said as she settled herself. "Trust in your gift, trust in freedom, and above all, trust in yourself. You are more powerful than you know, Ethan, and you are not alone." As if to emphasize her words, the distant sound of engines shattered the peace of the forest. Blackwood and his men were close. Too close. Ethan took a deep breath, centering himself as Mara had taught him. He reached out through his connection with Freedom, feeling the horse's strength and courage flowing into him. Together, they were more than just a boy and a horse. They were a force of nature, a living embodiment of the bond between human and animal that Ethan's father had sought to understand. "Let's go, Freedom," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the fear churning in his gut. "It's time to show them what we can do." With a powerful surge of muscle, Freedom leapt forward, and they were off. As they plunged into the depths of the forest, leaving Mara's cottage and the approaching danger behind, Ethan felt a curious mix of terror and exhilaration. He didn't know what challenges lay ahead, what dangers they would face. But he knew that with Freedom by his side and the legacy of his parents, work flowing through his veins, he was ready to face whatever came their way. The true test of his newfound abilities was about to begin, and the fate of not just Ethan and Freedom, but perhaps the entire world, hung in the balance. As they raced through the forest, boy and horse moving as one, the next chapter of their extraordinary adventure was about to unfold. Chapter 8. The Chase. The forest blurred around them as Freedom galloped at breakneck speed, weaving between trees with a grace that seemed impossible for his size. Ethan leaned low over the horse's neck, his mind merged so completely with Freedom's that it was hard to tell where his thoughts ended and the horse's began. Behind them, the roar of engines grew louder. Blackwood's men were in pursuit, their vehicles crashing through the underbrush with none of Freedom's agility, but with a relentless determination that sent chills down Ethan's spine. "We need to find a way to lose them," Mara shouted over the wind rushing past them. "Head for the river. The current's strong this time of year. They won't be able to follow us across." Ethan nodded, not trusting his voice. He didn't need to speak aloud anyway. A gentle pressure of his knees, a shift in his weight, and a burst of intention through their mental link was enough to guide Freedom in the direction Mara had indicated. As they raced towards the sound of rushing water, Ethan's mind was working overtime. The ease with which he was able to communicate with Freedom, to anticipate and respond to the horse's movements, was exhilarating, but it also terrified him. If this was what he could do with just a few days of training, what might he be capable of with more time? And more importantly, what might someone like Blackwood do with such power? The trees thinned, and suddenly they were bursting out onto the riverbank. The water churned before them, a frothing mass of white rapids that roared its challenge to the sky. For a moment, Ethan hesitated. It looked impassable, deadly, but Freedom didn't slow. Through their connection, Ethan could feel the horse's confidence, his absolute trust in his own abilities and in Ethan's guidance. There was no room for doubt. "Hold on!" Ethan shouted to Mara, and then they were airborne. Time seemed to slow as they soared over the churning water, Ethan could feel every muscle in Freedom's body working in perfect harmony, could sense the calculations the horse was making about distance and trajectory. It was like nothing he had ever experienced before, a perfect melding of human intellect and animal instinct. They hit the far bank with a jarring impact that nearly unseated Mara, but Freedom's sure footing kept them upright. As they scrambled up the rocky shore, Ethan chanced a look back. Blackwood's men had reached the riverbank, their vehicles skidding to a halt in a spray of gravel and mud. Even from this distance, Ethan could see the frustration on their faces as they realized their prey had escaped. But his relief was short-lived. One figure stepped forward, his tailored suit incongruous in the wild setting. Even across the rushing water, Ethan could feel the weight of Blackwood's gaze, could see the cold determination in his eyes. "This isn't over, boy," Blackwood's voice carried over the roar of the river. "You can't run forever. What's inside you belongs to me." A surge of anger rushed through Ethan at those words. He felt Freedom tense beneath him, responding to his emotions. Before he could think better of it, Ethan reached out with his mind, pushing past the boundaries of his connection with Freedom to touch the consciousness of the animals in the forest around them. It was overwhelming at first, a cacophony of wild thoughts and instincts that threatened to drown out his sense of self. But Ethan held firm, focusing his will as Mara had taught him. "Show them," he whispered, not sure if he was speaking aloud or merely thinking the words. "Show them they're not welcome here." The response was immediate and awe-inspiring. Birds burst from the trees in a great cloud, their cries filling the air. Squirrels and chipmunks swarmed down trunks and across branches, chattering their defiance. And from deeper in the forest came larger shapes, deer stepping delicately into view, a bear rising on its hind legs, wolves slinking out of the shadows with teeth bared. On the far bank, Blackwood's men stumbled back in shock and fear. Even Blackwood himself looked shaken, his usual composure cracking as he faced this display of nature's power. Ethan sat tall on Freedom's back, his eyes locked with Blackwood's across the divide. In that moment, he felt the full weight of his inheritance, the responsibility that came with his gift. He was a bridge between worlds, a guardian of a power that could reshape the relationship between humans and the natural world. "I don't belong to you," Ethan called out, his voice carrying with a strength he didn't know he possessed. "This gift doesn't belong to anyone. It's a trust, a responsibility, and I won't let you abuse it." With those words, Ethan turned Freedom away from the river. As they melted back into the forest, the army of animals dispersed, leaving Blackwood and his men alone on the riverbank, shaken and suddenly unsure of their mission. As the adrenaline of the chase and the confrontation began to fade, Ethan felt the enormity of what he had just done settle over him. He had touched the minds of countless animals, had called them to his aid with nothing but the power of his will. It was incredible, terrifying, and utterly exhausting. "That was quite something," Mara said softly from behind him. Her voice was filled with a mixture of awe and concern. "You're more powerful than I had realized, Ethan. But remember, with great power comes great responsibility," Ethan finished for her, his voice weary but determined. "I know. And I promise I'll use it wisely." As they made their way deeper into the forest, putting as much distance between themselves and Blackwood as possible, Ethan's mind was whirling with questions and possibilities. He had discovered abilities he never dreamed possible, had tapped into a wellspring of power that both thrilled and terrified him. But he also knew that this was just the beginning. Blackwood wouldn't give up easily, and there was still so much about his gift and his past that Ethan didn't understand. As Freedom carried them towards an uncertain future, Ethan made a silent vow. He would master this power, would use it to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. And someday, somehow, he would uncover the full truth about his parents and the legacy they had left him. The forest embraced them, hiding them from prying eyes as they journeyed onward. But even as they found temporary safety in its depths, Ethan knew that their greatest challenges still lay ahead. The battle with Blackwood was far from over, and the true test of Ethan's character and his newfound abilities was yet to come. As night fell and they made camp in a secluded clearing, Ethan lay awake, listening to the nighttime sounds of the forest and feeling the gentle rhythm of freedom's breathing nearby. He reached out with his mind, brushing against the horse's consciousness, drawing comfort from the unwavering trust and affection he found there. "We'll face it together," he whispered into the darkness, a promise to freedom, to himself, and to the memory of parents he had never known. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." And as he drifted off to sleep, Ethan could have sworn he felt a response, not just from freedom, but from the very forest around them, a whisper of assurance, a promise of protection. He was not alone in this fight, and with that knowledge, he could face whatever challenges the dawn might bring.